So this episode is going to look at the HPA axis, or the hypothalamic-pituitary-gland-adrenal axis, if you prefer. I'm sure you won't. I'm sure you'd prefer the HPA axis. But nevertheless, what we're going to look at is what it is. So what are these structures? What do they do and how do they communicate with one another? And then get in more like the clinical picture. So what does it look like when it's dysfunctional, both from a hyperactivity perspective and from a hypoactivity perspective? Once we've kind of like established what that might look like, we're then going to think about, well, how does acupuncture fit into this picture? As always, we're not suggesting that this replaces medical advice. We're not suggesting that you go ahead and do acupuncture instead of seeking a GP if some of these symptoms are severe. But this could be an added element to your practice. It could be something that you look out for when you're discussing and asking about symptoms in your subjective history. And it can also help you lead to decide which acupuncture points to choose. So before we dive straight into this, just bear that in mind that we're thinking about how acupuncture may be helpful in these scenarios. And this is certainly a reflection on how we believe it may work. So let's dive on in. Okay, so to start with, the hypothalamic pituitary gland and adrenal axis is probably no surprise, made up of three separate structures: the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, which kind of just sits at the end of your brain, and the adrenals. The adrenals sit on top of your kidneys. The HPA axis has a major role in neuroendocrine function, and it's probably important to remember, in fact, it is important to remember, that when we're thinking about these systems, it's never like a one-way street, right? They always do two things. And really, there's lots of surprising connections, or maybe not surprising, but like really fascinating connections to traditional Chinese medicine, which was developed all those years ago, in that the HPA axis is about maintaining balance and harmony. Some may say yin and yang, but, we're doing the sciencey stuff today, so it's not that, right? It's HPA axis. So the neuroendocrine system and the HPA axis, broadly speaking, it's involved in the stress response, it's involved in the immune system, it's involved in energy systems, mood, and just broadly speaking, homeostasis. If we then go and look at the specific elements of what happens. So remember, stress is a good thing, right? We need stress in our life. Stress is often reported and talked about in a day-to-day tone as to be a negative thing, right? And that's referring to when stress has gone on too long and it's present when we don't need it to be, and it's not advantageous to us. But stress is actually an integral part of our day-to-day functions, because it helps us get out of a situation that we're in, and it helps to motivate us and give us the capabilities of being able to do activities and do things. Now, that could be the fight or flight mode, for example. So if you're in a situation where it's critical to your survival to be able to get out of that, you need a stress response, okay? I mean, the common things that you hear about, if you're in a situation where you're being chased by an angry bear or a ferocious cucumber, you want to make sure that you're able to get yourself out of that situation. And physiologically wise, what you need to do is change the state that you're in from a rest state to an active state. And that is really what stress is about, getting you out of that situation. There's some other benefits to stress as well, which we're going to kind of go on to in a few minutes. So to start off with, the hypothalamus part of the brain detects the stressor. Now, the stressor may be a physical stress, so that could be something like an attack, like something like a physical stimulus to our body. It could be something where it'd be more of an emotional stress, because the emotions help to drive us into a situation. Or it could be an environmental stress. So it doesn't really matter what the stress is, but it's something that the hypothalamus interprets as a stimulus that is in, right, we need to act. Now, the hypothalamus then creates a hormone, ACH, which is, I'm going to read it from you here, right, because I always forget, is the corticotropin-releasing hormone, right, or CRH. When CRH is secreted from the hypothalamus, it doesn't just go out into the bloodstream and anywhere it wants to go. It goes down a very specific vascular route called the HP portal. H stands for hypothalamus, and the P, which you may have guessed by now, is the pituitary gland. So we get the the CRH produced from the hypothalamus down this vascular route that goes directly to the pituitary gland. When the pituitary gland detects CRH, this then encourages to secrete ACTH, which is adrenocorticotropic hormone. Lovely mouthful there. Again, ACTH, hence why I'm reading it off this screen, right? Because I could never remember the specifics of it. But nevertheless, the ACTH is secreted by the pituitary gland. And this time, this is not a very specific pathway. This is just kind of dumped into our bloodstream. The first part of it, the CRH, which is produced by hypothalamus to the pituitary gland, this takes about 30 seconds. So from stimulus to getting to the pituitary gland, 30 seconds, so pretty quick. The next phase of this, which is pituitary gland secreting ACTH to be picked up by the adrenals in the bloodstream, adrenals sit on top of the kidneys, it's about 5 to 10 minutes to be detected and acted upon by the adrenals. The adrenals detect ACTH in the bloodstream. That then produces cortisol. And cortisol is often referred to as the stress response. Many people have heard of cortisol, never mind if you work in health and wellness or if you're just a general person from the population, you may have heard of cortisol because it often goes hand in glove with stress. And in fact, that's a very good partnership, if you like, and because cortisol is kind of thought of as the primary stressor hormone. Now, when we get cortisol produced, it gets gradually more and more produced, and it seems to peak at around 15 to 30 minutes. So the most cortisol that we're going to get happens in between that period. And then we stop producing cortisol around about 60 to 90 minutes after the stimulus has been removed. So if we think of something like a physical stimulus, which can be gone and done and dusted within seconds, that can still be an hour and a half later before you have the physiological return to normal state, or the state that you were before that physical stimulus. An emotional stimulus can last quite a bit longer, right? But we've got to wait until the end of that stimulus. So when that stimulus is finished, it's still another hour and a half after that that the cortisol levels would resume to, or drop down to back to where they were prior to the stress. That probably makes sense, right? If you think of something where an emotional stressor has happened, it does seem to linger around a lot longer than, say, something like a physical stimulus. The physiological effects of this. So the HPA axis is really important in things like energy mobilization. So it can help break out energy from things like glucose, proteins, and fat. And that makes sense, right? Because if you think in stress response, you're thinking fight or flight. We need energy now. Energy is the thing that allows us to move, okay? So when we're stressed and in a short period of time, hint of what might come along later on, right? If we're stressed for a short period of time, it actually helps to increase energy production because cortisol helps to release energy from glucose, proteins, and fat. It also helps with immunomodulation. So if you think you're in a situation where you need energy to the active system, you need energy to help us get out of a situation or to do something, we need that energy and all of our energy reserves directed to this specific event. We don't want energy directed to other stuff that's not super important right here and right now. So the immune system is a good example of this, where we obviously need an immune system, but we don't need the immune system when we're trying to run away from that ferocious cucumber or the vicious bear. So we need to direct our energy reserves towards getting out of that situation. So what happens in this situation is that cortisol can actually reduce the immune response, and effectively meaning that our energy reserves aren't being spent trying to work on the immune system, but actually diverted and directed towards the more immediate thing that needs to happen. Cognitive function as well. So when we have cortisol in the bloodstream, it would seem that this helps to really help super focus our attention on the thing that is important. So, and again, this makes sense, right? Because if you're getting attacked, right, but by whatever kind of nefarious vegetable, right, or carnivore that's really sniffing blood, right, you need to get out of that situation, and you need to figure out how to get out of that situation. You don't want your brain thinking about the hue of the leaves, okay, or whether there may be a little toad hiding under a little dock leaf there. No, you want to get out of that situation, all right? And so what cortisol can do is help you really hyper-focus on really what's important. So that's a good thing. Blood pressure control. So when we are in that stress situation, we want blood pressure to be directed to higher blood pressure, because that allows us to contract muscles and get out of a situation. Now, in all them scenarios, I'm kind of really focusing on the increased stress response, but it's about a balance. So the HPA axis is also bothered about making sure that is not just continuously going up and up and up and up. It's not just about an on switch, it's also an on-off switch. So we also hear about something called the negative feedback loop. So we have a natural tendency to be able to detect how much cortisol we have in our bloodstream. So when we get to a certain amount of cortisol in our bloodstream, that triggers the hypothalamus to stop producing CRH, which means there's less CRH or no CRH going from hypothalamus to the pituitary gland, which means the pituitary gland isn't stimulated to produce ACTH, which therefore means if there's less ACTH in the bloodstream, there'll be less cortisol produced from the adrenal glands. So it's called the negative feedback loop, because when it gets to a certain defined point, and that defined point's different in everybody, when it gets to that point, the brain recognizes that and goes, dudes, we need to calm the hell down here. And so it effectively reduces the amount of cortisol produced, and therefore the amount of stress response that's produced. So what happens in the overactive HPA axis? So overactive HPA axis, probably one way of thinking of this is chronic stress and hyperactivity. So first up, if this has been going on for an extended period of time, we get anxiety and depression. There are many things that can cause anxiety and depression. This is not saying that this is the sole system responsible for it. This is just saying how the HPA axis might be involved in it. And that is through the neurotransmitter balance, and that because we're not getting that restoration. So if we've got an HPA axis that's constantly producing cortisol and constantly in a stress state, it has a knock-on effect to all other the other neurotransmitters, and that can lead to anxiety and depression. It can lead to weight gain and metabolic disorders. And that is because high cortisol levels then lead on to fat accumulation, particularly around the abdominal region. Now, earlier I said about how cortisol can help break down fat to be able to produce energy, which is the case when it's in a very short period of time. But over an extended period of time, the body starts going, you know what? We need energy. And we need energy for when we might not be able to access food quickly. So let's store anything that we need for a later date. So actually, long-term production of cortisol can actually get us to keep a hold of fat and store fat. Hypertension, so no surprise there, right? We said about an increase in blood pressure when we've got a stress response, which is a good thing when it's in short doses. But over an extended period of time, we can develop hypertension, which is effectively high blood pressure. We can have a weakened immune system, which is probably not too much of a surprise, given that we know that cortisol can suppress the immune system. That's fine. That's a good thing when we're in a stressful situation, which is going to last for a very short period of time. But if it goes on for an extended period of time, we're then in the situation where Yeah, we need our immune system, right? So you might find that picking up coughs and colds, very prone to infections. Yeah, the other thing that's an interesting one as well is that it can lead to cognitive impairments as well. So it seems to be, or there is a suggestion that cortisol can impair the function of the hippocampus. So the hippocampus being part of the limbic system, another important part of your brain, which is about memories. And so if our memory recall or memory generation is altered in some way, that can impact on basic cognitive functions. So it's probably not a massive surprise to see that link there, that if we're in a constant high state for an extended period of time, memory can be severely affected. Now, the flip side of this is that when we have the HPA axis underactive. So this is kind of thought out as either things like, broadly speaking, burnout, or you might sometimes hear the phrase adrenal insufficiency. So we've got, we've got like serious conditions called Addison's disease. So Addison's disease is where we have adrenal glands failing to produce enough cortisol. So people get things like low blood pressure, electrolyte imbalances, weaknesses, that kind of thing. But we have other stuff. So we have like chronic fatigue and burnout. So because we don't have cortisol being able to generate energy, we're kind of burning on energy, we're not being able to tap into our fuels, and therefore people start feeling exhausted quite quickly. We'll have a low stress intolerance as well. So because cortisol isn't being able to produce in enough quantities to be able to get us out of a situation, it doesn't take as much of a stimulus for it to be considered to be a stress, because we're not producing enough cortisol. And then finally, autoimmune conditions. So if you think that cortisol's job is to, in a lot of ways, to try and regulate how much immune system's going on, if you kind of take that a step further and think, well, if you don't have the regulator, if you don't have the brake through cortisol, then you're actually going to have too much immune system stuff going on. So we can potentially develop autoimmune responses. There is some thought that cortisol is linked to that. So because we're not producing enough cortisol, the immune system can just go rage, right? Just go mad, and can lead to excessive immune response. Now, from an acupuncture perspective, we hear, if I think back to like when I first started learning acupuncture, and certainly when I first started teaching acupuncture, the HPA axis was talked about as one of the mechanisms that we're bothered about. And I don't think that has changed. I don't think that our view on the HPA axis involvement in acupuncture has gone away. I don't think we've seen any evidence to say that it doesn't work on that. It's just more that we're probably more focused on things like descending inhibition, the limbic system, the autonomic nervous system, because they seem to be more profound effects. But I think the HPA axis and acupuncture definitely have a big link. So in traditional Chinese medicine, they don't talk about brain structures. They don't talk about pituitary glands and adrenal glands. It's obviously yin and yang. It's talking about meridians. But we can get some clues that although they might not use the same terminology as Western philosophical medicine approaches, they did appreciate that there was, I guess for want of a better phrase, an endocrine system. So there are 4 acupuncture points that are often, you'll see a lot of words that potentially mean like a neuroendocrine system. Governor 20, spleen 6, stomach 36, and pericardium 6. So those 4 kind of, I guess if we're kind of trying to put the HP axis into a TCM realm, we would say that those 4 points would be the ones to look at. Now, interestingly, when we look at the scientific literature and we look at the studies that have explored, does acupuncture influence things that we think are related to the HPA axis, we find that a lot of those points, in fact, all of those points are in the recipes. So for things like reducing cortisol secretion, Governor 20, pericardium 6, and heart 7 are ones that have been noted. For things like fatigue and cortisol imbalance, stomach 36 and spleen 6. Yintang, Anmian, and kidney 3 have been found in studies that have looked for things like sleep disturbances and insomnia. And then for things like immunity and inflammation, large intestine 4 and bladder 23, which seems to be a bit of a weird combo, but nevertheless, what I'm trying to get across here is that there has been some research that's looked at directly, does acupuncture influence things like cortisol? Can we measure the cortisol levels as a result of somebody having some acupuncture? As I said right at the top, we've got to take this stuff with a pinch of salt. This is not saying definitively acupuncture without question influences the HPA axis, but there's definitely some indications here. What I'd like to move on to now, though, is perhaps the stuff that you're more likely to see in here in your clinic, because nobody's coming into your clinic and saying, I tell you what, my HP portal has been in overdrive these last few years. They're not going to say that. They're not going to talk about, ACTH flowing around their bloodstream. They might talk about cortisol stuff, depending on who you get, right? But it's more likely they're going to describe specific symptoms that might indicate, hey, this could be an HPA thing. And I've got some suggestions here. Okay, so to kick off, we've got chronic fatigue and low energy. So they might say to you things like, I feel exhausted all the time. No matter how much I rest, I'm just knackered. Even small tasks drain us. I wake up feeling tired even if I've been sleeping for ages. They might also talk about caffeine. I need a coffee. I need a coffee to be able to get out of bed. I need a coffee to be able to just to function. Can't relate to that whatsoever. Anyway, this could be an HPA dysfunction. Okay, so it could be about low cortisol output. So remember, we talked about cortisol being an energy generator. So it could be about a low cortisol output, so maybe adrenal fatigue. And so that's why people feel exhausted, sluggish, that kind of thing. We might have sleep disturbances. So the phrases that you might hear is about people struggling to get to sleep, or they wake up really early in the morning. They feel that they've been asleep for ages, but they still could go and sleep forever and ever and ever, or that they're just totally wired. So that they're exhausted. I'm like, I need to go to sleep, but the brain's just bing. And that again is thought about something about cortisol rhythms. So high cortisol at night and low cortisol in the morning. And cortisol has a direct impact on melatonin. So effectively reducing the impact of melatonin. So we need melatonin to get to sleep. And that it's maybe as a result of an HPA axis dysfunction that we get that. Anxiety, depression, and mood. So people might talk about feeling constantly on edge. They might use the words like, I just feel stressed or I feel overwhelmed. They've lost interest in things that they used to enjoy, just not bothered about it anymore, like whatever. Patience is really thin, so they're really snapping easily, or they just talk about having a short fuse. Now, the HPA axis directly has an impact on things like serotonin and dopamine. So we know that dopamine helps the production of serotonin, and serotonin is the feel-good factor. So if the HPA axis is inhibiting the production of dopamine, we won't get as much serotonin produced, and therefore we won't have as much of that feel-good factor produced. People might talk about brain fog and poor concentration as well. So remember, we talked about concentration as the ability, or can be a direct impact from cortisol, right? We need cortisol to help us get ourselves into a focused position. So they might say things like, I'm struggling to focus. I just feel like I'm wading through a swamp. My brain's just all foggy. I get easily distracted and really get trouble about diving into specific tasks, or can't seem to process information as quick as I used to. So those are all kind of suggestions that there's an imbalance in cortisol and the impact that cortisol has on other neuroendocrine system. Interesting one about cravings for sugar, salt, other stimulants. So they might say things directly, I'm craving salty foods, crisps, nuts. They might have intense sugar cravings. So especially in the afternoon, so when the energy levels are starting to dip, they might start whacking down the old M&Ms, right? Need coffee just to function. So we talked about coffee before. If I skip a meal, I feel really shaky or I feel really irritable. So low cortisol can lead to salt cravings, and low energy can help to kind of make us look for ways to get that energy in our system really quickly. So it depends on caffeine and other stimulants. Weight gain, we've talked about before. Frequent illness and slow healing, again, we've talked about that. So they might talk about things, it's just taking us forever to heal from this. I used to be able to 10 days and I'd be back to where I was. Colds seem to hang around a lot longer than there was. We've talked about this already, about that's potentially lots and lots of presence of cortisol in the blood. They might talk about digestive issues, so things like IBS, feeling uncomfortable, bloated. Certain foods now really upset their stomach. Diarrhea on certain foods, or quite often, digestion just feels slow and sluggish. That's because the HPA axis directly influences your digestive system. Again, not a massive surprise, right? Because if you need to get out of a situation, your body doesn't need to be bothered about digesting the food that's in your gut. So if you've got lots of cortisol in your bloodstream, it's directing the energy and the concentration of energy away from your gut to other areas which it perceives to be more important. So the constant level of higher cortisol can actually have an influence on our digestive system. Other things is like muscle and joint pain as well. So they're just feeling sore and stiff all of the time, experience random aches around the body, and recovery from exercise takes a lot longer. And that can be things like, again, an HPA axis dysfunction. So there might talk about inflammation or low pain tolerance as well. So what we'll do is we'll put a summary table in here in the comment section, just so you can kind of get a feel of what is a comment that people might report, what is that symptom related to, and why might that be related to the HPA axis. I've got a few acupuncture points recipes that I was going to whiz on through here, which might be for each one of those sets of symptoms. This is really driven from a traditional Chinese medicine philosophical perspective. This is not driven from the research, but this is driven from a perspective of, well, these acupuncture points are thought to deal with these kind of symptoms, so there might be a nice collection. So this is us going through the traditional texts, having knowledge of what each acupuncture point and meridians do, and seeing if we can combine these together. So, protocol 1 for chronic fatigue and low energy. Governor 20, stomach 36, conception vessel 6, bladder 23, governor 4. You could also add in some electroacupuncture in there to stomach 36 and bladder 23. For anxiety and mood imbalances, pericardium 6, heart 7, governor 24, spleen 6, and then foregate, which is large intestine 4 and liver 3. You sometimes, there were a couple of other suggestions around heart 7 and pericardium 6 and being linked to the parasympathetic nervous system, but I think if we're doing purely a traditional Chinese medicine perspective, we don't need to link that to the Western stuff. Insomnia and sleep disorders, Yintang, Anmian, heart 7. No surprises there, given that there are lots of quotes on what those points do in terms of sleep and insomnia. Kidney 3, spleen 6. Again, you could add some electroacupuncture in there for those. Protocol 4 for weight gain and metabolic issues. I'm just going to put a caveat here, right? Is that when you look in Chinese medicine, right, they talk about acupuncture being helpful for this and potentially with metabolic issues to try and stimulate your metabolic system. There's energy generation to burn fat, that kind of stuff. I think when you're reading through this stuff, it's always, you need to bear in mind that in Chinese medicine, acupuncture is never a standalone intervention, all right? So you would always do acupuncture with other stuff. And in this instance, it's probably a strict diet of cabbage soup and lots of exercise. But if you're going to use acupuncture alongside it, stomach 36, spleen 6, large intestine 11, conception vessel 12, liver 3, and large intestine 4 again. For digestive issues and gut brain dysfunction, IBS, bloating, that kind of thing, conception vessel 12, stomach 25, stomach 36, spleen 6, large intestine 10. Chronic pain and inflammation, large intestine 4 and liver 3, good old 4 gates again. Stomach 36, bladder 23, gallbladder 34, spleen 9. For immune system support and stress, large intestine 4 and large intestine 11, stomach 36, bladder 13, conception vessel 6, spleen 6, and that'll be it there. I appreciate that's a lot of acupuncture points to go through, but again, we'll put these in the comment section so that you can be able to just copy and paste those and have a look. What I would say is that depending on what your training has been in acupuncture, you might not have done any abdominal points, and there's quite a few abdominal or anterior thorax points there. So don't just go ahead and bowl on in there. You really should have some training on how to needle over that part of the body. But for those of you that have done it, then there'll be some acupuncture points you've never done before. There's definitely some in there that I rarely do. Conception vessel 12, for example, governor 24. They're not points that I would tend to do very regular. But nevertheless, there are points that I've kind of gleaned from the literature, Deadman Atlas, that kind of stuff, to say, hey, you know what, these points might be helpful. So in summary, the HPA axis is a defined system that helps us with stress response. HPA stands for Hypothalamic-Pituitary-Adrenal and the adrenals, and these are linked together to try and create cortisol. So the hypothalamus produces CRH, that then stimulates the pituitary gland to produce ACTH, and after about 5 to 10 minutes, the adrenals then start producing cortisol. Cortisol really helps us in the here and now, helps us get out of a situation, which is great. However, when it's being produced for an extended period of time, it can lead to health issues. We have some people that can be hyperactive HPA, and we can have some people that are hypoactive HPA. Broadly speaking, this can lead to things like chronic fatigue, insomnia. It can lead to things with trouble with weight gain. It can have things like anxiety and depression and low mood. And so it can have a quite wide-ranging effect. We've listed a load of things that might look like and why from a physiological perspective. And then we've kind of delved into a little bit more around, well, what kind of signs and symptoms might your patient or client report to you in your clinic? Give you some suggestions of kind of like the top level TCM philosophical points: governor 20, spleen 6, stomach 36, and pericardium 6. Those kind of have been the 4 ones that crop up time and again. And then we also talked about, from a Western perspective, where the literature has looked at acupuncture having a direct impact on cortisol. But remember, the evidence base isn't super duper high quality, and there's not loads and loads of literature to say definitively acupuncture has this impact on cortisol. However, there is some literature to suggest it, and the things that we hear in our clinics from our patients after they've had acupuncture does suggest that we may be having a positive influence on the HPA axis. Finally, I'll give you a load of acupuncture points, and I've whizzed them all through because hopefully that gives you an opportunity to pause, rewind, and replay, but we'll also put this stuff in the comments. I hope you found that to be helpful. I'm sure you've heard this on many, many other podcasts, but please do subscribe. It'll take you 10 seconds to hit that subscribe button. Please leave a comment. You'll see other people have left comments on our previous podcasts, and that really does help us know that we're on the right thing, we're doing the right kind of stuff, the stuff that you guys want to hear. That is ultimately going to be beneficial for your day-to-day practice. So please do hit the subscribe button, do leave some comments, hit some likes, get in touch and let us know what you want to hear. For now, that's me. See ya.